It is a great honor to welcome once again on this show Nadine Strossen. She is the Professor Emerita of New York Law School, as well as the legendary former president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She recently has a new book out titled Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. Thank you very much, Nadine, for joining the show once again.
I'm so happy to be here, Chung. I want you to know, though, that although I have written the book, it won't be published until next fall. The wheels of publishing grind slowly. What a great honor to be a return guest on your terrific podcast.
Well, the honor is all mine. So I should like to begin first by addressing, if anyone's watching this on video, the big red cap that you're wearing.
Yes, please. You asked me to wear it, and you can see I'm very color conscious, so I'm wearing a color coordinated outfit to go with it. For anybody who is not aware, this would be expected to be the pro-Trump campaign cap. He pioneered the slogan, "Make America Great Again," abbreviated as MAGA, and his supporters to this day wear these MAGA caps. Now, given the great animosity toward Trump among about half of the American population, another half seems to strongly support him. On many campuses and in some other settings, just wearing a cap that said, "Make America Great Again," was attacked as hate speech. Obviously something that I oppose, but that is, I oppose censoring it as hate speech. I was so amused when I saw this takeoff on that cap, which is referring to John Stuart Mill. I hope all of those in the audience, because it says, "Make J.S. Mill great again," in case anybody's listening and not looking. I hope that everybody in your well-educated audience, Trong, understands that J.S. Mill refers to John Stuart Mill, the famous and influential British philosopher of the 19th century, who wrote a seminal classic work about free speech called On Liberty, which was published in 1859. And it sets out tried and true arguments in favor of free speech, which really stand the test of time. They're universal in their application, really applying to cultures around the world and throughout historic periods. So I saw this cap in the office of the CEO of a wonderful human rights organization based in Prague in the Czech Republic, IH21, a man named Adam Ruzicka. When I had the opportunity to speak to his organization, I think 2 years ago now. And when I saw this cap, I just burst out laughing. I thought it was so great and got so much pleasure out of it that he very generously donated it to me. And you saw it because there was a profile of me in the Wall Street Journal, I guess about half a year ago. And it included a picture of me wearing this cap. And that got a lot of attention. I tell you, heads of free speech organizations in the United States contacted me and asked whether they could produce and distribute the cap for their membership.
Well, of course, I'm very glad that you refer to my audience as well-educated, and I certainly hope that they are. But in case those who are not quite informed about who John Stuart Mill is, this hour we can discuss who he is, what On Liberty is all about, and why you stand by the message that is emblazoned on your cap, "Make J.S. Mill Great Again." But I'd like to first ask you to talk about your new book, Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. So what does everyone need to know about free speech?
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. This is published by Oxford University Press. It is part of a trademarked, the name is trademarked, What Everyone Needs to Know. There's a series that Oxford has been publishing for about 15 to 20 years, relatively short books written by experts, but for general audiences and written in a question and answer format. And the topics can be anything from, what everyone needs to know about immigration, or what everyone needs to know about astronomy, you name it, pick the topic.
Mhm.
And to my amazement, the series did not include a book about free speech, such a basic topic. So that was lucky for me, because I was so happy to have the opportunity to write it. And Trung, as you know, I've been spending pretty much full time for the last half dozen or so years when I'm not hunkered down writing. I spend the rest of my time traveling around the US and beyond the US, speaking about free speech. And in my preferred format is questions and answers. So rather than giving a talking head lecture, I will ask for somebody to interview me, ask some opening questions, and then I turn it open to whoever is there participating for their questions. So I have been doing nothing but answering questions about free speech, in more than 1,000 presentations in the last half dozen years, and tens of thousands of questions. So I really knew what the most important questions were in terms of where the major lack of information is, and B, where the major hostility or challenges or skepticism are. So some questions are really basic about what is the concept of protected free speech? What are the boundaries between speech that may not be restricted and speech that may be restricted? What are the criteria for distinguishing between the two, and so forth? And the other major group of questions are, well, isn't free speech harmful? Isn't free speech too absolutely protected? Isn't free speech only being weaponized by, powerful political and economic groups? In other words, all of the arguments, questions, but challenging questions about maybe free speech should be more limited than it is under current First Amendment law.
Mhm. So you mentioned those questions. How would you think John Stuart Mill would answer them?
Stuart Mill's On Liberty is amazingly relevant to today's times. And before I talk about how he would answer some of those questions, or how he did answer those questions in On Liberty, let me make one background observation, which is really important, especially now during Women's History Month that we're celebrating in the United States, which is that John Stuart Mill closely collaborated in writing On Liberty with his wife, Harriet Taylor, and so closely collaborated that the tribute, the acknowledgement that he paid to her at the beginning of On Liberty is so effusive and so extreme that many people ask themselves, well, he's giving her so much credit for her invaluable contributions to this book. Shouldn't she be regarded as a co-author, according to the descriptions that Mill himself gave about the enormous contributions she made? And beyond that question has been so intriguing that some scientists at a university in Britain, I'm sorry, I don't remember which one it was, used their I don't know exactly what their field is, but they specialize in using algorithmic techniques to evaluate writing. I mean, looking at patterns of word usage and so forth to try to assess authorship. And a study was recently done by several of these scientists within the last few years in which they conclude that Harriet Taylor actually was at least the co-author, and of a significant part of the book, they conclude by these data science, analysis of the writing, they conclude that she was actually the primary author of some significant aspects of the book. And that's really important because it is one of the classic landmark works of philosophy that's ever been written, and women are relatively underrepresented in the league of, such prominent works. So it's important to give credit where credit is due. And not to take anything away from Mill, people have speculated, why didn't he expressly treat her as a co-author? And she became very ill as the book was nearing completion. And some people speculate that he just didn't want to do it without getting her permission. So we can say make J.S. Mill, and then if I could amend it, I would say make J.S. Mill great again and make Harriet Taylor great for the first time. Now, one of the things that is absolutely fascinating about this book is that it focuses on the threats to free speech, not that are coming from government, but rather that are coming from social pressure, from peer pressure. And that is so amazingly prescient and so amazingly applicable to today's situation when we see rampant so-called cancel culture, which is a term that is used to refer not to hard authoritarianism of, governments imposing prior restraints or punishing speech through the criminal law after the fact, or even civil lawsuits. It's instead referring to the soft authoritarianism that comes from people self-censoring because they want to avoid the various kinds of retribution that society and that their peers can impose on them. The shunning and shaming, the ostracizing, the stigmatizing. When surveys are done in the United States for the past several years, they consistently show among all segments of our population, including, sadly, university students and professors, where you would expect free speech to be the most robust. More than 50% of people are reporting significant self-censorship, not addressing certain topics at all, or not voicing certain opinions for fear, not that the government is going to throw them in prison, or even that the university is going to, expel them or fire them if, for students and professors respectfully, but rather solely that they will be isolated, socially isolated, humiliated, ostracized, denied the opportunity to receive friendly interactions with their peers, whether faculty or students. So this is a very, very serious threat to the actual realization, the real exercise of free speech in 21st century America, just as it was for Mill and Taylor in 19th century Britain. And from reports I hear, Chuang, this has been a problem in other societies as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned Harriet Taylor, because we're recording this on Pi Day, 14th of March, and I would like to wish you a happy belated International Women's Day.
Thank you, which was March 8th.
Yes.
And in the US, we celebrate the whole month as
wow.
Women's History Month.
Of course, and happy Women's History Month to you as well. I would like to take a brief but necessary detour into one of Mills's other major work, which presumably he did collaborate with Harriet Taylor, namely on the subjugation of women. And
Yes.
My question now is that there is a strong correlation between how liberal a country is and the degree to which in that country women's rights are continually asserted and respected. So what is the connection between the defense of liberty and the defense of women's rights and gender equality?
Thank you so much for raising that connection. And for Americans who are watching this, I have to say that you use the word liberal, not the way it tends to be used in the United States, where we use that term to refer to people who on political or policy matters are to the left of center. And by the way, I know even in that connotation, liberal in other countries is much more moderate than it is in the United States. But basically, that's people of the left are liberal. You know, maybe to the extreme left, you would say progressives. But you are using it in the classic sense in terms of classic liberalism. And you use the word liberty. They come from the same etymological root, right? Believe in Enlightenment type era values of respecting individual liberty, freedom of the individual to make his or her their own choices about what to say, what not to say, what to read, what not to read, and so forth. And just as I expound on what that concept means, you can understand how it feeds into and is integrally interrelated with equality rights and with countering traditional forms of discrimination against certain demographic groups, including women, including racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. Because the key concept of liberalism is to focus on every individual. I mean, it is, and that no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, merely by virtue of being a human being, you are entitled to full and equal fundamental rights, and that preeminent among them, because it is so essential to enjoy and advocate for any other right, the preeminent right is freedom of speech and the closely associated freedom of thought and freedom of association. And so it's absolutely no coincidence that societies that have respected individual freedom are societies where traditional barriers to full societal participation by certain groups have gradually been eroded. Now, I have to stress gradually, because in the United States, you know, we proclaimed, Thomas Jefferson proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that all men are created equal. By the way, some historians believe that he used the word men there to refer to all humanity and was not excluding women, but women certainly were excluded from political participation even after the Constitution was ratified, and did not even get the right to vote until the 20th century. So I would say that liberty is a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite for pursuing equal rights. And I would say that, and it's no coincidence, Chuang, if I can elaborate on that. In fairness, freedom of speech, even though it was guaranteed in the US Constitution from 1791 on, when the original Constitution was amended to add the Bill of Rights, which the first provision of which is the First Amendment, which does include the free speech guarantee. Although that existed as a matter of law, it was honored in the breach and was not really enforced, was not really respected by government officials, was not enforced even by the United States Supreme Court in any meaningful way until the second half of the 20th century. So in fairness, we didn't really have freedom, meaningful freedom of speech, despite the legal right, just the way we didn't have meaningful racial equality, despite the 14th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution after the Civil War in 1868. We didn't have meaningful civil rights until the second half of the 20th century. And I don't put, and it's not a coincidence that those two movements became galvanized and made progress at the same time. If you look at the great free speech landmark decisions by the Supreme Court in the second half of the 20th century, almost all of them arose out of the civil rights movement. And there, censorship was being used to suppress all movements for equality and human rights throughout US history, including the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the movement for reproductive freedom, the civil rights movement, later on the LGBTQ rights movement. So not coincidentally, when the First Amendment became stronger, all of those movements for equality also became stronger. I want to make one point really clear if it's not, and that is I'm not suggesting that any of these battles has been won. We're still fighting for free speech. We're still fighting for equality, but freedom of speech continues to be, in my view, and based on my experience and my study of history, as well as my long personal experience, freedom of speech is an absolutely essential tool if we are going to continue to make strides in advancing equality.
Mhm. Well, I'd like to throw two quotations at you. One is from the Constitution of the United States, the First Amendment, which at this point you can present that beautiful mug of yours. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The second quotation comes from...
I'll drink to that.
Me too. The second comes from On Liberty itself, and this is my favorite passage of that wonderful, wonderful essay. To refuse a hearing to an opinion because they are sure that it is false is to assume that their certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. So both the wisdom of the First Amendment and of Mill comes from this one ontological assumption, is that either there's no absolute truth or no one is in possession of the absolute truth. Would you say that to be a correct one?
I completely agree. And one of the consequences of that tenet is that we all must have, or I guess one of the manifestations of that tenet is that we all must have humility, right? And we all must have curiosity. We may believe with all of our strength, and we may see all the evidence that supports one conclusion, but additional evidence can come in, new perspectives can come in. And how can we possibly be faithful to the pursuit of truth and understanding and wisdom and enlightenment unless we are not humble enough to believe that no matter how strongly we think we're right, we might be wrong, or we might learn something that will persuade us to amend or refine or revise our ideas. And that basic understanding, Chuang, is reflected. It's never said better than in On Liberty, as you say. But many Supreme Court justices in classic First Amendment opinions have voiced the same idea in their own words. I'm sure they arrived at the understanding independently. Maybe some of them read Mill, but I don't think we can assume that all of them did. One of my favorite statements is from Learned Hand, who gave a famous speech during World War II about which was called The Spirit of Liberty. And one of my favorite statements from that really important speech is, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is never too sure that it is right. So again, that intellectual humility. Conversely, I read somewhere, and this was not from Mill, and it's the same idea, but different words. I recently read somebody saying that, the greatest threat to liberty and to open inquiry is certitude, that somebody, it is the opposite, right, of being open-minded and humble and questioning everything and accepting the flawed nature of the understanding of all of us. I actually even recently had a very interesting conversation with a friend of mine who is a devout Christian, and I asked him, whether devout Christians believe that Jesus was flawless, and he said, no, that's a real subject of debate. That many devout Christians believe that, given that Jesus was in human form, that he too had flaws. So I think that shows that this is a universal precept among those who are seeking always to question and always to expand our understanding and our wisdom and even our faith.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to quote W.B. Yeats, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And
exactly right.
I'm glad you bring up the topic of religion, because I've ever since September I've converted to the religion of Catholicism, and I think a good understanding of theology and it can be a subject of debate, is that Jesus Christ, being all man and also all God,
exactly that paradox, right?
And it's also, I guess, subject to temptation, obviously, in his 40 days in the desert, as well as some of his moments of weakness in the Garden of Gethsemane. So I fully believe that Jesus, being all man, has his flaws and had his moments of weakness. So John Stuart Mill, writing about his
so
father.
Sorry, may I say something else about that, Chuang? Because that's exactly what my friend told me. He's a Protestant, but he seemed to have that, he told me the same stories. And but I read something recently about Jesus. And by the way, I'm Jewish, so I'm fairly ignorant of Christianity. Please forgive me, but I love learning about it. So I read something with great fascination that talked about Jesus as being the great questioner. And it was somebody who had analyzed all of the Gospels and whatever other accounts there are of what Jesus allegedly said, what the words are that are left to us. And there were just, so many questions, and that he proceeded to not so much to preach at people in a dogmatic, didactic sense, but to ask people to reach into themselves through this process of questioning. And that really, again, I'm sure that there are different interpretations among Christian scholars and theologians, but I thought that perspective was so interesting. And it certainly relates to the Jewish tradition in which he was educated, which is completely through questioning. The Talmud is nothing but questions and debates and arguments.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So in speaking of religion, John Stuart Mill says about his father, the great James Mill, his aversion to religion, in the sense usually attached to the term, was of the same kind with that of Lucretius. He regarded it with the feeling due not to a mere mental delusion, but to a great moral evil. Of course, I disagree with that vehemently, but nevertheless, being the atheist that both Mills were, he was also a great supporter of religious liberty. And so what is Mills's case for, I guess, defending religious liberty as an atheist? And also, why should religious people of all denominations care about defending religious liberty as well? And of course, I refer it back to the great First Amendment of the Constitution. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So why shouldn't the
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
yes.
And I think that's so interesting that the framers had this two-pronged defense of religious liberty. One is usually referred to as the Establishment Clause or the non-establishment clause. Many people summarize that as separation of church and state, which means that government must not favor religion. But there's also the Free Exercise Clause, which provides that government may not disfavor religion by prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And the key concept here, which completely parallels the key concept in both the Free Speech Clause and I think relates very much to on liberty, but let me first start with the First Amendment's two clauses, is this concept of government neutrality, right? That government must remain neutral among all ideas, among all beliefs, among all expressions. It is not the government's business, and the government has no power to prefer certain ideas or beliefs or speakers, or to disfavor and discriminate against other ideas, other beliefs, other speakers, other expression. And that core concept of neutrality is embodied not only in those two religion clauses, but the Supreme Court has interpreted it and called it the bedrock principle underlying the Free Speech Clause. It sometimes uses the term viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. The government must remain neutral as to the viewpoint or the content, the message, the idea that is reflected in expression. No matter how unpopular or despised that idea might be, by no matter how large a proportion of the population, by no matter how many government officials dislike or loathing or fear of the viewpoint or content of the speech, is never a justification for government restriction. Government may restrict speech only if it causes or imminently threatens some independent harm beyond merely disliking the idea. For example, intentional incitement of imminent violence, or a true threat that instills a reasonable fear on the part of the person who is subject to the speech, or defamation, which injures reputation, or fraud, which causes you harm because you've relied on the speech, or perjury in a court of law. It's not just solely dislike or disagreement with the viewpoint. So that concept of neutrality is just woven into every clause in the First Amendment, and it applies to free speech as well as to religious liberty. And I think I confess, I don't know what John Stuart Mill specifically said about religion. If he addressed that specifically in On Liberty, I confess I don't recall. The last time I reread it was probably more than a year ago. I try to reread it at least once a year, because it really stands the test of time, and every time I reread it, it shores up my own constant support and defense for free speech. But I don't remember whether he said anything about religion, but he certainly, the generalizations that he makes about free speech and free thought would certainly not exclude religion. They apply as to every realm of human inquiry and investigation. To the contrary, he makes the point that there's no subject, there's no idea, there's no belief that is off the table in terms of being subject to questioning and examination. Now, I suppose a distinction one might make, and I'd love to ask you, Trong, as a person of faith, that maybe one can say, well, there's a different sphere when we're talking about matters of faith, rather than matters that are subject to more scientific or, academic type analysis. That maybe one is a matter of reason and the other is just intuitive and beyond reason. So how would you, given your religious expertise and experience, comment on it? And then can you please enlighten me if Mill did say something specifically about religion?
Okay. I guess though, so I recently read On Liberty, and I'm still reading it. And although Mill himself did not mention his personal religious beliefs, he extends his defense of religious tolerance way more than the first guy, John Locke, did it. John Locke, despite his great defense of tolerance, he had some very nasty things to say about Catholics. Mill, on the other hand, extends it to Hindus and what he called Mohammedans, or what we call today Muslims. So his defense of free speech is very generous.
So it expressly extends to religious beliefs.
Yes. So I guess regarding your question about my religious beliefs and reason, I guess I would like to refer to the age-old medieval debate between Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham. William of Ockham is where we get the phrase Occam's razor from. Aquinas, who is a great believer in natural law, believes that reason is God's gift to man in order to figure out what natural law is. And he gives plenty of reason defense for his belief in God, and reason, I guess, reason proof of God's existence. Meanwhile, William of Ockham believes that reason would lead us away from God, and faith it's a lot more important than reason. So I certainly stand with Aquinas on that particular matter.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you. See, I told you, even if you read Mill once a year, at least speaking for myself, it's impossible to remember everything. So another reason to revisit it periodically.
Of course. So I would like to, since much of the voices that are, well, reason, but also speaking out against liberalism, the classical definition of it as understood, comes from a lot of well-spoken and thoughtful academic Catholics. I'm thinking of Patrick Nadine and Adrian Vermeule and Sohrab Ahmari. And they would take great issues with the neutrality principle that the state is currently taking, because to them, the role of government is to lead us to, or to protect the common good and to lead men and women to virtue. And so their government has to take a position on certain matters, whether it has to do with divorce or more controversially, abortion. So how would you defend the neutrality principle against these criticisms?
That's a very interesting point. I'm going to be having a program next week at Princeton University. You may know Robbie George, the very famous conservative Catholic political science professor there. And he and I are going to be discussing some of these issues because we want to model a civil debate or discussion between people who have some strong areas of disagreement as well as some strong areas of agreement. Sad but true, this kind of discussion is becoming more and more rare on American campuses, especially at elite universities, where students tend to disrupt any event involving a professor or a speaker whose ideas they disagree with. We recently had a very disruptive event at Stanford Law School. I digress a little bit, but Robbie George, despite our strong disagreement on issues such as abortion or even Establishment Clause issues, do very strongly agree on freedom of speech. And I haven't had a chance to ask him how that fits into his overall Catholic conservative philosophy. But let me just say so I may not be responding exactly to the critique, but what occurs to me from your paraphrase of those ideas, Trong, is that freedom of speech is especially important for any individual, or first of all, it's essential for everybody, no matter what government policies you're advocating, whether it's for what I call reproductive freedom, or whether it's what others call the right to life, or vice versa. Whether it's for more separation of church and state, or to tear down the famous Jeffersonian wall separating church and state. The basic tool that you need in order to advocate for any position is robust freedom of speech. And especially if you are a minority group, or you are advocating a minority position, you are especially dependent on freedom of speech. And because by definition, you're not going to have access to majoritarian power. And in the United States, the demographics have been rapidly changing, where people who belong to any official denomination, religious denomination, are rapidly fading. That's true for Catholics and other Christians, although interestingly enough, I think the immigrant populations from Latin America and are probably swelling the ranks of Catholics to some extent, but we have just record numbers of people who are religiously completely unaffiliated. So to advocate a Catholic position, it's probably a minority position, and therefore you are particularly going to be dependent on individual freedom. And then you can use that freedom to advocate that the government adopt policies that you think are consistent with promoting virtue. We saw this operate in the United States quite dramatically. Starting, I don't know what you want to pick as the starting point. One could, I'll pick 1973 as the starting point, when the Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade, and held that women do have a right to make their own choices about abortion within certain limitations. And that quite quickly gave rise to a pro-life, anti-abortion movement, which was very successful in passing a lot of restrictive laws, getting the Supreme Court to cut back on Roe versus Wade, and then last year, very dramatically, to completely overturn Roe versus Wade. And since then, to pass dozens and dozens of laws in many states that reflect what I assume that the proponents consider to be a more virtuous kind of behavior, outlawing not only abortion, but counseling abortion, and aiding and abetting abortion, and teaching about abortion. Recently, we had an incident in one of our states with one of these laws that no government money can be spent to advocate for abortion in any way. A community college had an art exhibit that included an image of so-called abortion pills, and that was our medical abortion pills, and that was what I would say is censored, but was taken down consistent with this law. And none of that could have happened if they had not been allowed to advocate what at the time was a minority position. And through constant advocacy, constant exercise of free speech rights, very strategically and effectively, I give them credit, it became a majority position, or at least a majority on the Supreme Court and in many state legislatures.
Mhm. Yes, of course, I stand by the Orthodox Catholic position on abortion, but the way I see it, especially in the wake of that Supreme Court verdict, I see that there is an oasis of reason arguments either for or against the practice, but it is surrounded by an ocean of unreason and high emotion of either for or against the practice. And and that brings us to the contemporary, what I call threats, or these to liberalism, and that I think comes from both the left and the right. Um, I think the First Amendment is certainly something that both moderate lefties and moderate right wingers, conservatives and liberals, can uh, can stand on common ground on, because the radical elements of either side uh, would dislike that the right to free speech the most. I'm thinking, obviously, you mentioned the college campuses where certain ideas are not to be discussed because it, I guess, the students or the opponents fear that it goes out bounds of, I guess, civilized debate. And on the right, you have the governor of Florida, Ronald DeSantis, and aided by Christopher Rufo, intervening in the curriculum of higher education. Um, I guess my question now to you is, so how can we better defend the right to free speech and liberalism? And I'm referring now to that Ronald Reagan quotation of how freedom is only one generation away from extinction.
Yeah. I can throw the question back to you, Chuang, since you're a student. And in all seriousness, I ask myself this all the time because that is my overriding goal at this period in my life. I do think that free speech is so crucial for every other cause, including the human rights causes that are especially important to me, and B, unprecedentedly endangered. I am constantly asking for how can we protect it and going beyond the legal protection, which is quite secure, to the cultural protection. And here, education is absolutely critical. I think a lot of hostility toward free speech results from ignorance about what it really is, as I adverted to earlier. Many people who attack free speech have a caricatured, distorted version of it, that it's completely absolute, that it never recognizes that speech can do any harm. And that's why I wrote this new book, Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know, because even though I separate education about free speech from which I do in my constitutional law classes, for example, that's distinct from advocating for free speech, which I do in my capacity as a leader of free speech organizations. The two really overlap because in my vast experience, and there's been some evidence to shore this up, the more people are familiar with free speech principles, the more supportive they become, because these principles really overlap with common sense. Certainly, the more familiar they become with the history that gave rise to these principles and some of the history that you and I talked about earlier, that until the advent of strong protection of free speech, movements for social justice and human rights and equality simply were thwarted because censorship was the major tool that was used against them. When that history is understood, people, especially people who think that they oppose free speech because it's only helping to support conservatives or white supremacists, when they understand how essential it has been for causes of the left, progressive causes, they tend to become much, much more supportive. So education is certainly extremely important, necessary but not sufficient. Another necessary but not sufficient contributor to increased protection of free speech has to be from leadership. We have too many law school deans, university presidents, government officials who attack free speech far from supporting it. You know, who prop up students who are shouting down and deplatforming speakers rather than disciplining them, who make completely untrue statements such as hate speech is not free speech, you know, or disinformation should not be protected. So we need the opposite. We need strong leadership on the campus level and also at the level of all government officials, and you know, from the local level to the national level. But the reason why I say I'd like to hear your answer as a student is that the culture cannot be changed only through top-down efforts. It also has to be grassroots efforts, right? Again, going back to that key point that Neil is focusing on, it's peer pressure that is the problem. When you look at surveys of students as to what it is that they're fearful of that makes them engage in self-censorship, the vast majority of them say they're not afraid of their professors. They're not afraid of university administrators. As a professor, I pat myself on the back. We generally get good grades from our students about not retaliating against them for saying things that we disagree with. They're afraid of their peers. They are afraid of other students. And by the way, faculty members say that they're afraid of students. So, and you know, we can't force a change in the student culture. That has to come from students themselves. And it's a very hard thing to do. I would be the last person to say, but I do hear some people my age saying to students, oh, just have courage, have the courage of your convictions. Much easier said than done. We have so many tenured professors who confess that they do not dare voice their true beliefs for fear of being subject to the mob. So how can you possibly say to a student who is at the beginning of his, her, or their academic career and professional life, how can you possibly say you should stick your neck out and take a risk? That's really disingenuous. The best I can come up with, and I've spoken with so many students about this, is that they have to start creating networks of their own through word of mouth, forming organizations that are devoted to free speech, that are devoted to civil discourse, that are devoted to hearing different perspectives and having respectful, difficult conversations on challenging subjects. There are many, many resources for doing these kinds of things that you can easily find online from organizations such as Bridge USA, More in Common, Heterodox Academy, the Bipartisan Policy Research Center, on and on and on, because and there are many universities now that have whole departments for civic engagement and civil discourse that also make these resources available. And I have on many campuses now, including recently at a major Ivy League university, I'm not going to mention it, because it's kind of sub rosa. It's only by word of mouth. And sadly, the students are so concerned that if word gets out that they're fraternizing with people who have different views, that their lives may be made so miserable that they want to keep it under wraps. But hopefully, as their numbers grow, they will become more emboldened.
Mhm. Well, I'm always happy to welcome the opportunity where I temporarily become the interviewee, where the guests would ask me questions, and I'd like to answer your query. This answer may surprise you, but the book that really solidified my defense of free speech, it's actually not anything by Mill, not anything by Locke, but that book by J.D. Salinger, The Catcher in the Rye. And I think that in order to convince students, younger people, like people of my age group, I think it would be a great book in persuading them. First of all, it's very short. And secondly, it is something that almost all young people can relate to in the complicated feelings that Holden Caulfield expresses. his humanity and his obviously his defiance to authority that any and all young person can relate to. And secondly, you cannot be for free speech if you don't conceive of I guess humans as individuals. That is the perfect antidote against tribalism and other affiliations of identity politics. And Holden Caulfield certainly thinks of himself as an individual. And of course, once the person in question really enjoys that book, I would say that that book, along with a great variety of great books in American literature and beyond, were subject to bans. And sometimes its authors, in the case of Salman Rushdie, very recently, were violently attacked because they write these works that reveal such depths and profundity about humanity and the human condition. So I guess I would say that, well, start with Catcher in the Rye, and I think in the defense of free speech means that you show and exhibit a curiosity to learn more about what does it mean to be human. So that's my answer.
Wow, that's such a fascinating answer. Thank you so much. I am immediately going to reread it. And I confess, unlike On Liberty, which I regularly reread, I have only read Catcher in the Rye once when I was in high school. So I'm way overdue for rereading it. Thank you so much. I'm really indebted to you, Chuang.
Oh, well, I very much appreciate that. It is certainly the book that sort of formed my character in some ways. So final
How
question.
young were you when you
Yes.
How young were you when you first read it?
I believe I was 16.
Me too, but that was a long time ago for me. So thank you for. Okay, one more question. Time has gone very fast.
Of course, I very much enjoyed this talk so far. I'd like to quote from that great American writer, H.L. Mencken. The trouble with fighting for human freedom is that one spends most of one's time defending scoundrels. For it is against scoundrels that oppressive laws are first aimed, and oppression must be stopped at the beginning if it is to be stopped at all. And I'm assuming, despite the diversity of politics between yourself, Mencken, and Mill, you are all of one mind regarding this quotation. So please, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
You know, there again, as with a core idea that we talked about at the beginning, this is such a fundamental precept that one encounters it over and over and over again. And one of my favorite formulations of that same idea is attributed to the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, will be very familiar to you. I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. Now, again, in honor of Women's History Month, let me say, Voltaire himself never actually said that. It was an accurate paraphrase of his view, but that very quotable phrase was penned by a woman. A biographer of his in the early 20th century, an American woman named Evelyn Beatrice Hall. And interestingly enough, the last time the United States Supreme Court quoted that phrase in an opinion about a year ago by Chief Justice John Roberts, he actually attributed the quote to her. But it's the very same idea that, of course, we can predict that wherever power lies, whether it be in an authoritarian dictator or the mob or a democratically elected legislature, the popular speaker and the popular speech is not going to be the one that is subject to censorship. It's going to be the unpopular message, the minority speaker, the representative of a marginalized or disempowered group. And we always have to keep our eye not on whether we like or agree with the particular message or the particular speaker, but the underlying principle, and to have the humility, going back to another key theme, that our own ideas at some time in some place are going to be equally unpopular, and we therefore are going to depend on that same principle if our free speech is to survive and thrive.
Mhm. Well, and on that note, thank you very much, Professor Nadine Strossen, for this wonderful conversation. You've been very gracious with your time and your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Chuang. As always, I learned a lot from speaking with you.
And likewise, I wish you all the best with your future speeches and your books and your meeting with Robert George, great thinker, greater banjo player, and of course, make John Stuart Mill
Oh,
great
you
again.
okay, and I look forward to getting the link so I can send it to my friend Adam, who gave me the cap.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, till soon. Best wishes in your studies, too, and finding a better program.
Thank you. Thank you.